What would you think if I told you most guitarists, including myself, are completely insane? That's according to the definition of insanity, as doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a completely different result. I see so many students, and I used to be one myself, that learn scale after scale, arpeggio after arpeggio, and we practice and practice to get faster and cleaner. But somehow it doesn't translate into becoming more creative and playing the kind of cool guitar solos that we really want to. Well, in this video, I'm going to show you a way to practice common tools like scales and arpeggios so that you don't just remember them. You're going to be able to use them to write and improvise and finally play the way you really want to. Now, you might be nodding your head when I talk about being stuck in a feedback loop of memorizing scale after scale and spending 99% of your practice time trying to get to where you can just dial up the metronome a few more clicks. But let's give ourselves a break and blame this circular way of thinking on the way that music has traditionally been taught, which is all about memorization and repetition. So my own experience. As a teenager, I had a teacher that taught me a lot of great things. But when it came time to learn how to play solos, his teaching consisted mostly of handing me huge stacks of scales and saying, memorize this stuff. And I was a good student from that perspective. I memorized everything he told me to. But I still couldn't play creatively and solo. Why? Well, here's a dirty little secret about learning. Just having something memorized doesn't mean you understand it well enough to use it creatively. Memorization is at the bottom of the 6 levels of the learning hierarchy. It just means that you can regurgitate something like a parrot that learns to speak a few words. Let's take some scales and arpeggios and walk through the other levels of learning and knowing. And it's my goal for you to have an entirely new way of practicing before we get out of here. So grab your guitar, let's get into it. Let's start with a scale pattern. We're going to use G major, and the first step in learning is memorization. So here's a pattern. We're going to play frets 3, 5, 7, 3, 5, 7, 4, 5, 7, 4, 5, 7, and 5, 7, 8. Pretty easy to memorize it. If you don't know this scale pattern, if you worked at it, I bet you could have it memorized in no time at all. But if all you knew was that fingering pattern, no matter how good you got at playing it, you'd be pretty limited in how you could use it. Now, the next level of learning after memorization is understanding. And what are some things that we need to understand about a scale? Well, let's brainstorm a little bit. Each scale has a specific formula to the intervals that makes it unique. The major scale starts with the root note, in this case G. We move up a whole step to the second, or A, another whole step to the third, or B. We only move up a half step to get to the fourth, or C. Another whole step to the fifth, which is D. A whole step to the sixth, which is E. A whole step to the seventh, which is F sharp. And then a half step to get back to G, an octave above where we started. Some things you may have never been taught or thought of on your own. There's 2 half steps in the major scale formula. The first one is going from the third to the fourth, and the next one is going from the major seventh to the root. Now, this is super important when you start making up licks, because half steps create a lot of tension that wants to be resolved. As it's important to memorize the name of the intervals. We have the root, the major second, the major third, the perfect fourth, the perfect fifth, the major sixth, and the major seventh. What's important about that is if you understand the intervals in the major scale, it's really easy to understand how to manipulate them to create other modes and scales. Like, all we have to do to get the Mixolydian mode is change the major seventh to the flat seventh. Now, application as far as soloing goes is all about playing the right notes over certain chords. The triads in the key of G major are G major, A minor, B minor, C major, D major, E minor, F sharp diminished, and we're back to G. Let's pick 4 of those chords: G, D, E minor, and C, or the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 4th chords, a 1, 5, 6, 4 progression. And that gives us the most popular chord progression in existence. So let's apply the G major scale over that chord progression by starting at the root of each chord and playing a 2-octave scale pattern using the G major scale. Now, I realize that you may not know all of these patterns, so I'm going to make them available for free over at my Patreon page. I'll also put up diagrams in the video as I play through them. Now, something to note. For each 2-octave pattern we play, we're going to play the first 6 notes as 16th note triplets and the last 9 notes as 16th notes. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we're doing that to make that 2-octave pattern fit into the measure. So just by practicing some application, we're already having to analyze and adapt what we're doing, which is getting us closer to that ultimate learning stage of creative thinking. I'm going to play through the scale patterns using roots on the low E string the first time, and then scale patterns with roots on the A string the second time through. Here we go. Now, once you think you know a scale, I can't recommend it highly enough that you try playing it like this over a progression, starting with the same root note as the chords each time they change. I promise you it's going to humble you at first, but that's a good thing. Don't let it get you down. Now, we just played an entire 2-octave scale pattern over each chord, but having our solos sound like scale practice isn't exactly what we want. Another way not to just apply, but to start to get creative with scales is to come up with a motif, a short, recognizable phrase, and use that same phrase over each chord, but again, with a different root. Let's use this motif. For each chord, we're going to start at the root and we're going to ascend 6 notes. Then we're going to drop back a third and ascend 2 notes. Drop back a third again, ascend 2 notes. Drop back a third one last time and ascend 2 notes. And then drop down a third, which is going to bring us back to the root. We're going to play through the changes 3 times. We're going to use roots on the low E string, then roots on the D string, and lastly, roots on the B string. Check this out. Well, okay, now we've gone from playing straight scale patterns to something that sounds a lot more musical. We're moving in the right direction. And taking a fragment of a scale, turning it into a sequence, and then moving it all around the neck, that's a big jump in understanding and application versus just playing a straight scale. Now, let's move on, do some similar things with triads. Now, triads are crucial tools for really understanding the fretboard. And since they comprise the root, the third, and the fifth of each chord within a key, they're also essential to the idea of chord tone soloing. For the sake of time, we're just going to look at shapes on the G, B, and E strings. For the major triads, we have 3 shapes that we call inversions. And the inversion with the root note as the first note is what we call the root form. The inversion with the third as the first note is what we call the first inversion. And the triad with the 5th as the first note is what we would call the second inversion. Now, what I would call the most simplistic way of playing the triad of each chord in our progression would be to play the root form of each triad, G, D, E minor, and C. But as you can see, we had to jump all around the guitar neck, which is not ideal. But with some memorization, understanding, and now application, we can adapt and realize that for each G inversion, there's an inversion of the other 3 triads we need, either in the same position or within a fret or 2. For instance, here I am with this G root form at the 10th fret. There's a D triad right here. There's an E minor triad at the 12th fret and a C triad at the 12th fret. Let's play through the chord changes 3 times. Each time we're going to start with a different inversion of G major and then find the closest inversions of the other 3 triads. Let's give it a try. It's so important if you really want to ingrain a concept to vary how you practice. You got to mix things up. Memorizing one set of inversions and jumping all over the neck is kind of like memorizing a mathematical formula and being able to solve an example problem. Whereas being able to problem solve and play through the different inversions wherever you are on the neck is like knowing that mathematical formula so well that you're able to use it to solve a variety of problems. It means you didn't just memorize it, you truly understand it and can apply it in different situations. Now, after simple application comes analyzing and evaluation. And here's a secret to turning techniques into melodies, licks, and solos. We said that triads represent chord tones. And that would mean that each time we play a triad, there's 4 other notes from the scale that we could use that aren't chord tones. For right now, let's just say that we're playing simple major and minor chords. These non-chord tones introduce tension into the sound, which we can then resolve by moving back to one of the tones of the triad. For this exercise, we're going to get crazy and we're going to use 2 inversions per chord. For instance, the G major second inversion and the root form. Now we've got in the second inversion the 5th, the root, and the major third. And then for the first inversion, or the root form, we have the root, major third, and the 5th. And I'm going to create a little melody by starting with the second inversion and playing the 5th, root, and third, and then the 4th, which is a non-chord tone. And then I'm going to grab the 5th from the next inversion and bend it to the 6th and then release it. Then play the 4th again, slide up into the next inversion and bend the 3rd to the 4th and release it. Play the 2nd, play the root, bend it to the 2nd and release it. Back to the root. And we can make up a different lick over each chord using that same process. Now this is higher level thinking and practicing. We're getting way beyond regurgitating simple patterns now. Let me play through the chord changes using this approach. Let's go. You know, I could keep talking about this all day, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface. The point is, if you want to make real, lasting progress with your guitar playing, you've got to move beyond memorizing. Once you've memorized something, if you keep repeating it, keep practicing, you may get cleaner, you may get faster, but you've stopped learning anything. You have to dig in and get an understanding of how the notes that are in a technique that you might be learning relate to the chords that you're going to be playing over. Once you understand that, you can start applying the concept in different ways to really ingrain the techniques. After you gain some fluency in being able to move the techniques around to fit a chord progression, you can analyze, evaluate, and then start to get really creative with not only the notes you choose, but the phrasing that you add to really dress those notes up. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hit that subscribe button, and best of luck with your playing. Work hard, have fun. I'll be seeing you soon.